Mayor Frey, Mayor Carter, it's an honor and a pleasure to have you here. We've all been waiting for this session all day, especially me. We've been planning for it, and it's an informal conversation. It's a fireside chat, but it's an important one. Today's session all day was about reimagining our cities, our future of our cities. And coming out of the pandemic and coming out of the George Floyd murder, there's a lot of things that have happened. They've thrust both of you and all of us onto the world stage very quickly with a lot of impact, and people are watching us. So really, the session's topic was bringing the future forward fast, because I know you both are doing so much work, but it can't be fast enough. And there's impatience, and there is a lot of ideas. So I'm going to just ask you some plain, vanilla, straightforward questions, and get your thoughts on all of those. And there'll be a Q&A at the end. So guys in the room and people online, please keep your questions coming in. We will keep time for some Q&A with the two mayors. So with no further ado, question for both of you, whichever can go first. If you had to paint a picture 5 years out of your cities, how would it be different from today, and what would be the key elements of that picture? What would you have in that picture?
Well, Sabina, thank you so much for having us. Mayor Carter, it's a pleasure to join you back doing these fireside chats yet again. We used to have these fireside chats pretty routinely without the fire itself.
Oh, really?
But this is obviously extraordinary to be back in person again. And I think in order to figure out where we have to go, you have to determine where we've been. And you can't talk about where we've been without acknowledging the murder of George Floyd, recognizing that while police accountability was a huge part of recognizing this magnitude of this moment, it's not just policing. It's economic inclusion. It's housing justice, it's food justice, it's ensuring that communities of color don't systemically get cut out as they have been, and that we're making sure that the precision of our solutions match the precision of the harm that was initially inflicted. And when you look at the area specifically in tech or finance, there have been a number of practices that have very intentionally excluded communities of color. And so that is what we need to revamp at the moment. We need to be doubling down on some of the partnerships that we have with some of our institutions that are already in existence and do tremendous work, whether that's our hospital system or our university system. I was just learning very recently about the necessity, for instance, of having cybersecurity in medical devices. And maybe it's something that I just never thought about before, but if you have some device that is in your body, and that body, for instance, and that the device regulates your heart rate, then if somebody were able to attack it, well, you're not just talking about your email getting busted up, we're talking about death. And so that is just one of many examples where I think we need to look at everything from a comprehensive approach, and we need to do things differently than we ever have before. And a big part of that is through inclusion itself. But what I find, in conclusion, before I pass it off to my counterpart, Mayor Carter, we shouldn't settle for just being pretty good in the upper Midwest. The Twin Cities have the opportunity to be world class. And so we should be challenging Silicon Valley. We should be looking to the coasts to say we need to match that, because we can. We have this amazing class of entrepreneurs. We have a budding class of entrepreneurs of color that are already doing extraordinary things in the sector, and I think we need to advance that even more.
Thanks. Mayor Carter, your comments, and any comments for the audience?
Absolutely. One, thanks for having us here. This is fun. I echo the mayor's comments that, it used to be we'd do something like this once a week, it seems like, and I was on my way over here and couldn't remember the last time we got a chance to be in person doing something like this. So it's great to be in this conversation. I couldn't agree more. We have experienced a lot. As a world, as a community, as a city, as a state here in Minnesota, we've been through an enormous amount of trauma and crisis and grief over the last year. So my grandfather, before he passed, used to always say, if experience doesn't teach you, then nothing will. And my hope, my prayer as a country, as a city, as a community, that we've learned over the last year or so is that as long as one person in our community can't afford a home when it comes time to shelter in place, can't afford to take 2 weeks off of work when it's time to quarantine or when it's time to, care for a sick child, can't afford to go to the doctor the moment they feel like they have symptoms, worries about whether they can count on every law enforcement officer in our community protecting and serving all of us, then we're all less safe. Our last 20 months have been an undeniable, undebatable crash course in all of those fundamental truths. We've had voices who have told us that before. Paul Wellstone said, we all do better when we all do better. And we've heard voices who have said things like that before, but we just had a crash course. We've test-driven those truths. And my hope is that we as a community, we as a city, we as a state, we as a country, take those truths and operationalize them into something different. All that to say is, I share with folks oftentimes that St. Paul is a city of prosperity and a city of opportunity, but the truth is that's not new. St. Paul has been a city of opportunity for a very long time. Minneapolis has been a city of prosperity for a very long time. But our legacy, in as much as it is the Fortune 500s who have chosen to call this space home, in as much as it's the incredible river that weaves its way through us, in as much as it's all these universities and incredible research spaces, in as much as our legacy is the culture of innovation and this startup culture that we're celebrating in Startup Week, in as much as all of those things are our legacy is also a legacy of disparities and exclusion, in which we have people in our communities we know well who feel like they grow up, that they live in the shadow of the tall buildings we build downtown. And so I think the thing, we're doing a lot of things differently. Our mantra is we can't just do different things, we have to do things differently, right? And we're changing the way that we approach literally everything. Just last week, we launched a new American loan fund that provides no-interest loans for St. Paul residents who want to apply for citizenship. Applying for citizenship costs, I think, on average, $725 per person. And there are people who otherwise could apply for citizenship if they had $725. And so we're partnering with Affinity Plus Credit Union to say, here's an interest-free loan to apply for your citizenship. And a reporter, when we announced that, asked me, is this a new direction for St. Paul, betting on new Americans? And I said, yes and no. It's absolutely our direction. And yes, we are, of course, betting on our new Americans in our community. But the truth is, our goal is to bet on us. It's to bet on our children. It's to bet on our workers. It's to bet on our businesses. It's to bet on our entrepreneurs. It's to bet on it's to bet on ourselves every single chance we get. And ironically, and this is something that's become something of an aha for me over these last couple of months, it's actually a rejection of what we're used to. The traditional models of city building that we're used to. The traditional models of city building that we're used to center around, I think, two things. One, it's a public safety strategy that comes from like the Wild West that's about finding the bad people and chasing them out of town. And an economic development strategy that says if we can find a good business in Wisconsin or better yet Minneapolis and pay them some money to move to St. Paul, then we're doing things great. The problem with that approach is that it only identifies problems internally and it only identifies potential externally. It's not going to work. And to the mayor's point, I think that's what we saw in as much as people were protesting last year, the fact that a police officer inflicted that incredible harm, that a police officer murdered George Floyd, a former police officer murdered George Floyd. I think the bigger point is that we have seen all of these systems that are built, that are sustained, that are maintained, that are funded with our public dollars, ostensibly to serve us, actually hurting us. And we've seen that economically, we've seen that in public safety, we've seen that in education, and that's what I think people are rejecting. And so as I look back 5 years from now, I hope that people will look and say, the city of St. Paul, the state of Minnesota, use this learning experience, that we shifted our direction. We have enormous opportunity, thanks to the Biden administration, through the American Rescue Plan dollars, to actually make strategic investments to launch this new direction. And my hope is that 5 years from now, we won't just be talking about it, we'll be able to really see that path.
Differently, we want to do things differently. We just don't want to be different. And that's the innovation in your governments, in your teams, right? So how are you addressing that? Because that's a big piece of the puzzle. So obviously there's a lot that's changed internally in the mindset, actions. And then to the fact that with the infrastructure bill and the money coming down, are we building for the 21st century or are we building for the 20th century? where is your bet? What are you guys focusing on?
That's the question. So I ran
Yeah.
track for Central High School. I'll do this one first if it's okay. I ran track for Central High School growing up, and I was at the stadium just a couple of weeks ago, or a couple months ago, I guess, sometime this summer. And I would argue that I've run just as many, if not more, laps around that track than anyone ever has in my lifetime. And for the first time, as I was leaving, I saw the cornerstone of the building, and it said WPA 1940. And it just floored me in that moment that in 1940, somebody said, we're going to take this investment and spend it in a way that 60 years later, we're going to send some St. Paul kid to college on a track scholarship. And so as we think about this big infusion of capital that we have through the American Rescue Plan dollars, our goal can't just be to check off the checklist of stuff that we've kind of had on our bucket list. It's got to be to solve some solutions in ways that our grandchildren will look up and say, dang, I'm glad they were there. In some ways, as mayor, I don't think my job is all that much different than yours. I saw a video this morning of Steve Jobs, and he was talking about how a technological solution that starts with the engineers will never be all that good, ultimately. He was saying, it's got to start with the end user, the user experience, the value add that we're creating for our customers. It's got to start there first. If we start with, here's this technology we have, how do we sell it? This is what he was saying this morning. He didn't say it this morning. I was watching it this morning. But he was saying, if we start with this technological solution and say, how do we sell it, it won't be all that good. If we start with saying, how do we make people's lives better and build back to how do we build it, then that's kind of where, that's where the beauty lies.
Mayor Frey, any thoughts on that?
You know, in talking about doing things differently, as Melvin mentioned a second ago, it does start with actually listening to people and finding out where they're at. And when I took office, we made a conscientious effort to reach out to a number of different jurisdictions and people specifically that were experiencing homelessness in our city. We talked with the school board, the school directors, teachers, educators, and one of the things that they said is, all right, we have around 8 or 9% of our Minneapolis public school age population that is experiencing homelessness, and an even higher percentage have severe housing instability. And so what we decided, based on that feedback, was we would give them homes. You provide homes within a certain radius of their school. And that worked so well, we serve now 3,000 kids, tons of their families. And now that number has gone drastically down in terms of the number of kids that are actually experiencing homelessness in our MPS system. But we didn't want to stop there. And you figure out how to provide wraparound services. You provide opportunities for parents to learn to code. You provide those children with the stability so that they can go into the school and have the ability to learn as opposed to worrying about where they're going to sleep at night. And if you're thinking this has no linkage to tech or no linkage to entrepreneurship, you're dead wrong. You again need to have that foundational element of stability and housing before you can start taking the next step to becoming an entrepreneur. And people have extraordinary ideas if you just let those ideas thrive. The next thing we looked at was something called MSP Tech Hire. MSP Tech Hire is a program that was actually started by the Obama administration back in 2015. We have expanded on it every single year. Why? Because it's been successful. To this date, we've served around 2,300 people, 1,800 of whom now have jobs, like right here in the Twin Cities. It is working. They've increased their rate of pay by something like $15 an hour. I don't mean they're making $15 an hour. I mean they've increased it by that amount on average. And then to take it one step further, there's another program that we should probably look at working through the county and the cities combined is, right now we have a whole lot of employers that are looking for skilled workers everywhere. I mean, we hear about it constantly. Employers that need skilled workers. We have skilled workers that are looking for a job. But for some reason, they're not making the connection between the two. In some cases, maybe the employer doesn't want to spend 2 or 3 months just training this particular individual up so that they're ready to really hit the ground running. And so, why not bridge that gap? Why not fully sponsor some of those employees for those first few months to get trained in? And at the end of those first few months, what do you have? You have an employer that has a skilled employee. You have an employee with a job. And you don't need to pay the cost of whatever benefit you had previously been paying. It kind of works all around. So these are just a number of ideas and ways that I think that we can be pushing the envelope even further.
Yeah. So just kind of continuing that conversation, two of the most commonly used words in the last 1.5 years was about technology and equity, because the pandemic showed us that tech is all over our lives. Whoever you are, wherever you're from, whatever you do, access to healthcare, education, work, whatever that was. What part of that, and how are you addressing that, making sure that that tech equity never goes away? It is a utility that is available to everybody in the cities.
Well, I'll start off. Part of it is MSP Tech Hire, which I just mentioned just seconds ago. And this is a program, again, that was started that works and that we need to both continue as well as expand. And if you look at the tech industry in particular, the biggest success stories right now are all coming from BIPOC communities. It's incredible the work that is happening, and I think we shouldn't be looking at it like from a 5 years down the road standpoint. I mean, these are the CEOs and the entrepreneurs and the innovators and the disruptors. By the way, I love that word, disruptors. When anybody ever asks me what I want to be after I'm a mayor, I tell them I want to be a disruptor. I have no idea what that means yet. But nonetheless, these are the disruptors and innovators, not just of tomorrow, but of right now. We see that happening every single day, these extraordinary success stories that are coming out of the Twin Cities right now. And I think, in a way, the cities can provide the canvas. There are instances when we can bolster, we can support, we can subsidize. There are other instances where it's more get out of the way and let us do our thing. And I think both of those are valuable tools when utilized correctly.
Yeah, I fully agree. We have a... I think maybe sometimes I feel like the number one rule of being a good Midwesterner is if you're really excited about something or you think you're doing something like really, really well and it shows promise, you have to make sure nobody ever knows. And in many ways, like the work that we're doing in St. Paul around tech, we've got this initiative that we built called Full Stack. And the goal is to add tech jobs and add tech businesses and add tech events and add just the narrative, build the narrative. And one of the things that we found out really fast is it wasn't about like creating things whole cloth. It wasn't about creating new things from scratch. It's about recognizing we have all this amazing activity going on. We have all these amazing like entrepreneurs, all these amazing innovators, all these amazing disruptors from all of our communities. And we just haven't actually told the story in the ways that I think really resonates with people all over the world. In ways that really resonate with our young people and make our young people want to see themselves in technology. In many ways, as I was listening to Mayor Frey talk, a lot of what we're talking about, again, is what you do every day, is how to think of of an old problem through a new lens, right? And for example, when we've been trying to figure out forever, how do we do a better job teaching homeless children, when in the end, that's the wrong question to ask in the first place. And if you ask the wrong question, you can never get to the right answer. We had just this exact same thing a couple of weeks ago as school was starting up, and we, like many cities across the country, were facing a school bus driver shortage. And we had to stop for a second and say, wait a minute, are we looking for more school bus drivers, or are we looking for ways to get more children to school? And all of a sudden, it opened up a whole bunch of different avenues that we didn't have access to kind of before that. And so our goal is, on one hand, to build this kind of full stack initiative that I just talked about that's really bringing together a lot of the folks that are already in this space in the Twin Cities and are already in this space in St. Paul to like be able to signal boost each other and to be able to kind of really build that critical mass that can be exciting and that can be that we can build a momentum around. And it's connecting it with this strategy that we have called Tech for All. Part of the thinking behind Tech for All is this notion that we probably have, between the Science Museum and all the different types of things that we probably have some pretty decent opportunities for a young person who looks up today and says, I want to learn how to code. I don't think we have enough young people who are looking up today and saying, I want to learn how to code. And so part of our strategy is this Tech for All work, as we're trying to figure out how to get young people in communities of color interested in technology. And in order to do it, we got to figure out how to get them to put down their cell phone and put down their iPad. Well, that's technology. And so our goal is to just meet them wherever they are. and so we're showing up with gaming trucks in public parks. We're showing up with drones in public parks and just different things like that for robotics kits in our public parks. We've launched, one of my rules is we don't have enough money to pay people who aren't driving an agenda. And so that's why our accountants, for example, we've launched an Office of Financial Empowerment to say, let's help people in our city learn how to make money work for them. Our city attorney's office, who's used to kind of representing the city with a capital C as their client, we're saying, how do we set our city attorney's office loose, helping people expunge a felony and, kind of those types, making the law work for them. And in the same way, our technology office knows their job isn't just to keep the printers working. Their job is to launch robotics teams in our recreation centers. And so we're doing a lot of that type of work as well to meet those entrepreneurs, those innovators that Mayor Frey was talking about, and while we start generating and populating intentionally the next generation of innovators in our community who will be ready to take the types of jobs and the opportunities that you'll be creating in all of the startups that we're celebrating this week. Which is why you have to continue to build your startup right here in the Twin Cities metro area, because if you move it somewhere else, you won't be able to take advantage of all of this momentum that we're building as a community.
I was going to ask you a fun question. Well, not a fun question, but a light question. 1.5 years, tough on all of us. So what is the funnest thing you've done to recharge and relax in this last 1.5 years to get back and get a sense of sanity? I'm sorry, I don't use my mics. Whatever. It could be anything. Everything is possible.
I don't know that it's a sense of sanity. We both have 1-year-olds, and so I don't know that I would add that adds a sense of sanity, but I know that added a lot of fun for both of us, and we were able to pull them together for a play date and be able to do some of that. I'll tell you, one of the coolest days for me in the last 1.5 years as mayor, outside of the fun of being a parent and being a husband and being all the stuff that we do in family, is the Sunisa Lee Day parade that we did.
Yeah.
I don't know if you guys heard, but a young lady from St. Paul won the all-around in gymnastics at the Olympics this year.
Yeah.
And we got a chance to celebrate her with a big parade, and it was one of the most amazing moments that's ever happened anywhere on the planet ever, and it was so much fun.
Awesome.
We have had a tough year.
Yes.
Let's just be very real. I remember back in March of 2020, and I was sitting at my desk, and in one hand I had a pen, and I was about to sign an emergency declaration to take quick control and regarding COVID-19, to issue a mask mandate for our city, to close down bars and restaurants, do a number of other things. And on the other hand, I had a cell phone, and I was FaceTiming with Sarah, who was in the hospital, coincidentally with Melvin's wife, Saksena, who was serving as the midwife. And she was pointing the phone at the sonic or the ultrasound. And so I was looking at my future baby, Frida. And I was thinking to myself at the time, this is the most important moment of my professional career in one hand, the most important thing of my entire life in the other. And then George Floyd was murdered. And then the subsequent unrest. And then an economic downturn that caused a city budget crisis where we had to institute a hiring freeze, having our employees who are doing magnificent work, but they had to do more with less. It was a heavy year. And I'll tell you, during the toughest of times, you wake up and you just commit a few things to yourself. You say, all right, number one, I'm going to tell the truth. No matter what, you tell the truth. Number two, you try to do the right thing. And obviously, sometimes that's up for debate. And number three, you just kind of keep putting one foot in front of the other and you breathe. And breath becomes such a critical element. And I always recognized the importance of breath. I, like Melvin, was a runner. He was a sprinter. I was a distance runner. But it gains all the more importance, especially when you're going through tough times. And so, I got out for routine runs, making sure that I was able to kind of digest some of what was being experienced around all of us. And we had the most extraordinary little baby in Frida. And she has no idea what's going on in the rest of the world. and that's kind of a good thing. And the reprieve that that gives you, and the additional perspective as well. You know, everybody talks about a kid changes your perspective, a kid changes the way you look at things. And it's perhaps cliche, but it is so damn true. You know, it changes everything, the way you have a perspective of the world. And I certainly have learned new lessons over this last year, perhaps more than any time in my entire life. And those lessons you use to become a better mayor and hopefully a better person.
Did you get a running stroller?
You know, so Melvin's got a running stroller. I use a stroller to run, but it is not a running stroller with, you know, the three wheels with the one on the front. And Sarah insists that one looks ridiculous, but two, you know, Frida's bouncing around like this as we roll down the path along the river there. No, it's I think that'll have to be the next step.
I got a running stroller and I can run. And I think one of the most amazing discoveries of the last year is I've got like a bicycle kind of mount thing that I put on that I can mount my phone on the handlebar of the running stroller. And I realized that I can have meetings on Zoom with my headphones in while running the river. And I think that is one of the most incredible discoveries that I've made in the last year.
That is awesome. So should I
think my staff really likes it when I do that.
So should we assume that a pre-qualification for a mayoral candidate is to be a runner for the Twin Cities, since you both are runners?
I think we both would say we spend a lot of time running, running around.
Exactly. Okay. So how can we help? You're sitting with an audience inside and online with the disruptors and entrepreneurs and all the innovators and all the creative ideas. You are dealing with a lot. And I know that you have a lot of initiatives in place to help us. As you reimagine your cities, what are the areas that you want us to focus on? Just do whatever we want to do, or come back and invest and build businesses that help the community?
Well, first off, some of the very best ideas that I've had are not my ideas at all. They have come from all of you. And when I mentioned earlier about creating the canvas and that sort of foundation from which others can excel, I really meant it. And I think we have some magnificent opportunities. You know, we all talk about how unprecedented the last year has been, and that is true. But in the face of all of these unprecedented crises that we've experienced, I think there are a number of really clear opportunities. First, the whole way people work has dramatically shifted. And I think to a certain extent, you know, remote working was, to a certain extent, it was inevitable, but it was probably expedited by 5 or 10 years. So now, likely, we will have at least some commercial space that is available that was not previously. This should be innovation space. This should be space so that disruptors and innovators can kind of hold court, show their craft, engage with one another, and then create something that is ultimately better than it would have been if they were in individual homes themselves or in individual offices themselves. I'll give you a statistic. I saw the other day, I was reading this science magazine. Believe it or not, it was a science magazine. And what they said is that the number of patents goes up about 40 to 50% with every doubling of the number of professionals that work in the science industry in a given space. So in other words, if you have 5 scientific or technological professionals and you get 10, you previously had 1 patent, you'd think you'd now get 2, where you actually get like 4. And so that bump, I think, shows the necessity for us all to use this space right now as an opportunity to do things differently than we ever have before. And so that plus push us. You know, there are areas where we are not getting it right. There are areas where we are missing a vital segment of the community or the population that is on the brink of extraordinary things. And we have incorrectly let it fall between the cracks. Tell us. Work with us. And I think ultimately when you've got these partnerships between government and the private sector and our educational and university spaces and healthcare systems and disruptors and innovators, that's a recipe for success.
Yeah, I often tell folks that if you think of whatever your preconceived notion is about St. Paul, it's probably 100% true like 50 years ago. Because I'm rarely in spaces around the country, and the truth is even in St. Paul, where people assume that St. Paul is a majority people of color community. I'm rarely in spaces where people assume that in our public schools here in the Twin Cities, our children speak over 100 different languages at home. I'm rarely in spaces where people assume that we have the number of colleges and universities that we have the richness of all this waterfront that we have all the opportunity, all the diversity, all the prosperity that exists in our community. I think part of one of the challenges in Minnesota, and I talked about our disparities, when I was running for city council the first time 15 years ago or so, I remember telling some folks, I love Minnesota so much, I want some of it in my neighborhood. Because when we think about ourselves, we think of ourselves as an education state. We think of ourselves as a home ownership state. We think of ourselves as a wealth state. We think of ourselves as a health state. All of those places where we sort of plant the Minnesota flag are also places where we have some of the worst disparities in the nation. And I think part of that is because our communities have reinvented themselves. Our population has grown extensively. Our demographics have changed significantly. And we find ourselves too often, and I was really intrigued by the way that you worded the question to ask us, are we building for the 21st century or for the 20th century? Because I think a lot of times we find ourselves trying to solve 21st century challenges with a 20th century kind of mindset and 20th century tools as well. I say all that to say that one of our goals is not just it is to serve our communities of color and the communities that we've traditionally and historically missed, but our secret weapon to be able to do that is by hearing those voices in ways that we've never heard them before. You know, the one common sense statement that I share every day with my constituents is every decision is made to benefit the decision maker. And so if we want to eliminate disparities, we need a broader set of decision makers. It's obvious, right? We need a broader set of decision makers in our community who are thinking along the lines of a broader set of problems. One simple thing that we did, my first year as mayor, we eliminated late fines in our libraries. And it's a simple thing, and I tell folks all the time, the reason is because libraries, late fines don't do what we thought they did. We thought that they make people bring their books back, but what we realize is they make people stay the heck away from the library. No judgment at all. Raise your hand if you know what I'm talking about. Okay. The rest of you are dishonest. I kid. But it was a new approach to an old problem. When we did it, we literally saw double-digit increases in library use in all of our lowest income communities. And that's not double-digit, compared to flatline. That's double-digit growth versus kind of library use across the planet declining, right? Because the internet is our biggest competition, right? The thing that unlocked it is seeing our libraries through the eyes of our frontline users and our frontline staff who are able to tell us, right, that, wait a minute, this $10 late fee when I became mayor, 50,000 St. Paulites had their lending privileges revoked in our libraries for as little as $10 in late fines going back 10 years. How ridiculous is that? And what we found out is while there's no disparities in our city in who brings books back late, there is a significant difference that for some of us, that $10 late fee means dinner for our children. And if only those of us for whom that $10 late fee is a distraction or an inconvenience or is like a, kind of a frustration, if we're the only ones making policy, we'll never know that a simple policy shift just like that can fundamentally redefine what a library is in our neighborhoods. All that to say is, if you're a disruptor, if you're an innovator, your job is to solve problems, right? Am I wrong? Your job is to solve problems, and best case scenario, maybe problems that other people have looked at and said, there's no way to solve that. And so at some level, I think of myself as air traffic control. If you take off, fly high, and land safely, like, our job is done, right? We will be benefited from that. And so as you just think about who your target markets are, as you think about who your audience is, as you think about how you pitch, capital, as you think about how you venture capital, as you think about how you build your business, my goal, my request for you is whatever you're disrupting, whatever industry you're disrupting, whatever startup you're building, whatever problems you're thinking about how to solve, maximize the universe of your potential customers in St. Paul. Maximize the universe of your potential users in Minneapolis, and do that deep work that you do, that I know that you do, to study the folks who you're trying to solve problems with and identify what those problems are so that we can bring 21st century solutions, maybe even 22nd century solutions to address those 21st century problems, and our community will be better off because of it.
Yeah, that was really good. In an earlier session, and I want to be mindful of your time, in the morning we were discussing about the library example of how libraries are spaces, to your point, about reinventing. Are they spaces for providing government services? Are they co-working spaces for the community? Because they have the broadband and all the facilities in it. So it's much more than just books return and books take. So it just kind of struck me to mention that to both of you, that is maybe a starting point for all of us. And the other aspect about, as an entrepreneur, how do I give back? How does each of our businesses, whether you're a social impact or a for-profit business, how do we give back? And how do we build that into our business model? And more so, it's happening, but how do you enable that? And how do you partner with the government and the city to make some of that possible? And those are the kind of partnerships, as entrepreneurs, we would like to see forging, and the access to forge those with people like yourself and your teams. But with that, I don't think we have time for questions. We can take maybe one question from the room. Anybody? Question? There, Will.
What is one important truth that very few people agree with you on? One important truth that you believe in that very few people agree with you on.
All the smart people agree with me on most things, I find. It's a good question.
It's a really good question.
One important truth that I most disagree with you on. I don't know that you may decide that the answer I'm about to give is a cop-out. And I'll let you guys chew on that after I leave the room. But I think one of the things that's been our focus is that there's a lot of spaces, particularly in public safety and particularly maybe in economics and social kind of services, where we, and I don't just say we as in St. Paul, I say we as in our country, the globe maybe, govern and make policy and resource decisions totally based on like the worst possible anecdote we can come up with, as opposed to really letting ourselves be guided by like real data. And I tell folks every day, I think one of the most important phrases that I say oftentimes is research tells us, because so often we haven't existed in that research space. We created a college savings account initiative because research tells us that children from low and moderate income families who graduate from college with a little bit of money set aside for college, who graduated from high school with a little bit of money set aside for college, are three times more likely to go. So we're using research in our public safety space. It's actually, I think, in many ways, new and innovative to use research to guide our public safety approach. Our approach to public safety has got to transform from this approach that's really centers around, we've been promised that police, prisons, and prosecutors will solve all of our problems from a public safety perspective, and we've increased our spending in those things exponentially, but we're still saying we haven't received the outcomes that we want, so we're saying increase it even more. And that we haven't experienced those outcomes, so we have to shift. All that to say is, our focus on data, I think on both sides of the politics, ends up pulling me away from the kind of extreme spots that advocates end up being in, and I end up kind of finding myself in this kind of middle space, in some cases arguing against what seems like common sense, because that's why we have science, that's why we have research, to either prove or disprove what the things that seem like common sense, and saying, let's let ourselves be guided by the data, let's let ourselves be guided by the science, let's let ourselves be guided by independently verified research, and not whatever that thing is Uncle so-and-so said when I was growing up. And so that's I think, a space that I often find myself taking what feels like unpopular kind of opinions. Was that a cop-out? What do you think? Yeah. Okay, thank you. It's acceptable.
So I spent a good chunk of the time when Mayor Carter was answering thinking about what my answer would ultimately be. And you know, I think we've seen just these magnificent changes. Has anybody ever heard of the theory of the quickening? I believe it's an old Mayan principle. I could be totally wrong on this. That basically talks about civilization evolving in a way where things continuously move faster until they've reached this feverish pitch. And you see that in everything from transportation to technology to housing to the way that people engage and interact with one another to social media. And there is this notion that as we advance, that's progress in and of itself. But just to play devil's advocate, there are parts of those advancements that don't necessarily bring us forward in a good way. And so it kind of is there's two sides to this coin here. And you know, what I have seen, certainly since Trump was first elected, but it hasn't stopped since he's left, is this notion of us versus them. And this necessity that so many people feel to create either a them or a villain in order for them to feel better about themselves. And then when you combine that with depression, which we are seeing at rates far higher than ever before, and you combine that with a world where people receive information in a way that best suits what they already think. So they're bubbling themselves into what they already believe. You pick your own news sources, you pick your own friends, you pick who to follow and who not to follow until you start to believe that the entire world thinks and even potentially looks exactly like you do. And I don't see that as a way to see unity. I don't see that as a way for progress. So I think the necessity there is to every single day challenge yourself to think beyond the perspective that you presently have. Challenge yourself to maybe even view someone who you think is the worst of your enemies and where they might be coming from. And they may not be right. They may be dead wrong. They may have all sorts of moral issues themselves, but like we all kind of need to think about things from the other perspective just for a second. And then maybe even if you express that thought publicly, it's even better because then that gives everybody else the strength and the courage to say, let me think about it differently myself. And I think we all advance when that happens.
That's a great thought to end on. Thank you so much for your time and the conversation. And I hope everybody enjoyed this. And thank you for being here.